Okay, back again to a couple slides about the role of women. And like I said, this is one aspect of Islam that has a very bad reputation. Um, you know, uh, that women, and let's face it, are often treated very badly uh, within many Islamic countries. So the issue is, what is culture and what is the religion? And a lot of people do things in the name of religion, but how much of that is not really religion, but let me rephrase that. How many people in our own churches and our own cultures make what we really understand as cultural issues into religious issues? So I've lived in places where Christian women didn't wear pants. If you wore pants in public, you weren't Christian. If you drink alcohol, you're not a Christian. Well, go to other parts of the world. That's not the case. Women who wear makeup, women who talk back to their husbands. I don't know. All sorts of cultural issues that, the sheep's, wolf in sheep's clothing. What is it that's actually part of the religion? And that's the question that I want to come down to. I'm not here to defend or bash how women's rights in Islam, but just to talk about what's at the ground, what's there. What do they start with? So to go through this, then it seems that in many instances, infanticide was a big problem in the ancient world anyway, particularly of girl children. So I think the universal proverb that I've heard in relation to Islam and other Asian religions as well, to raise a daughter is like watering someone else's garden. So as Muhammad took over and as Islam developed, it forbade the practice of killing infants. And again, most of those infants were girls. So we've already talked about how women were included in the inheritance. So they would actually have money of their own. And this is ancient. It wasn't that long ago that in this country that women were not technically able to have their own money. So marriage. Now this is different than how it's often practiced. But again, what is the religion and what is culture? So fidelity is required. To be a practicing Muslim, you must be faithful to your wife. A woman cannot be forced into marriage. Again, there are many cultures, both Christian and all around the world, where women have no choice. But in the religion itself, in the faith, in the Quran, women are required. It's required that women be allowed to have consent. So also then the legal tightening of the marriage bond. It was very, very easy in the ancient world for a man to get rid of a wife. But now in Islam, it is set up as the last resort. And in many ways, the laws of Islam mean that you have a lot of hoops you have to jump through before the courts will grant you a divorce. But this one also I find really fascinating. When, as part of the marriage contract, can't do a straight line. As part of the marriage contract, which is required of all marriages, that you have a marriage contract, there is a dollar amount that is set aside and does not belong to the husband, technically. And if he chooses to divorce her, that money becomes the woman, goes back to the woman. And so you cannot technically, again, divorce a woman in Islam and leave her without some financial support. So again, what's culture, what's religion? This is the religion. How it's practiced in reality, that's a different story. So one more slide about that. Of course, many of you understand that polygamy is allowed in Islam. Muhammad practiced polygamy, but the requirement is that each wife must be treated equally. So that the issue here is very often financial. It takes a relatively well off man to treat all of these wives to the same level of financial support. And so, in reality, unless you are very wealthy, uh, monogamy is the reality. Again, the other issue that we see a lot, veiling of women, is not Quranic law. I have seen women defend this with their uh, just with all sorts of passion, that this is what it means for me to be a Muslim woman, is to wear the veil. But technically, the Quran only requires that the Prophet's wives wear veils. And this goes back to actually the lifetime of Muhammad, when he as he got older and he had multiple wives. It was considered, how to phrase it, they were totally off limits, and they were kept with Muhammad, and you read the stories. He visited each one of them on a certain day, so he actually treated them all equally. But there was just that the men who came and went to consult with Muhammad were not allowed to see his wives, and that's where it comes from. But there is a rule of modesty. Um, this is the one. This is the Quran. Draw their cloaks closely around them when they go abroad. And out of that one statement, you get all of those. Everything from, modest dressing, what you and I might consider modesty, to the full. Robe with a woman with nothing but like a screen, literally, where you can't even see her face. That's a screen. So this idea of completely covering a woman is as much cultural as anything else. So, judgment, another big issue. Because there are very strong apocalyptic elements of in Islam as well. So they do believe, again, like Judaism, Christianity, that there is one life. Unlike Judaism, which is a bit unclear, Islam believes in a final day of judgment. This world will come to an end, and God will come, and we will be judged. But again, you don't have the sense of atonement or salvation. And so, who we are, we will stand before God. And, I'm not exactly sure how to unwrap this statement, but our souls will judge themselves as we stand in the day of judgment, and all falsity falls away. So we will see ourselves truly, and we will see ourselves as God sees us, and that is the judgment. They then also definitely believe in the concept of resurrection. So we will be judged. Some of us will go, and this is intentionally plural. There are different heavens and hells, depending. There's a lot of conversation, and some of it is described in very literal language. So you've probably heard about the idea of the 70 virgins, go to heaven, and is that literal? The Quran itself says some of the signs are firm and others are figurative. So there's just ways of describing that which cannot be described in human terms. So very much so. And depending on the different branches of Islam, Jesus will be a part of this coming day of reckoning, etc. So there is even that sort of sense building off of the second coming of Jesus as well. So I did have what I call here, etc. So those are just beliefs, but things that I have become issues for us in the West as we understand Islam, or should I say misunderstand. So I wanted to talk about religious tolerance first. This is not something that I think, our misunderstandings of Islam will let us see right now. But in general, the Quran and traditional Islam was very, very tolerant of non believers within their um, areas of political control. Forced conversions are not allowed. Now, they probably occurred, just like there were forced conversions to Christianity, even in our own country, among the Indians. But if you were not a Muslim, then you were required to pay the poll tax. So that's what this is. The poll tax was required of all non Muslims who lived in Muslim countries. So that would be the one exception. And you do then find that Jews and Christians, particularly in the early period, were fully involved. We see that their names mentioned as government officials, as actively engaged in the economy and the public life of the various regions, much more after a while the Jews. So remember the Sephardic Jews who, when they were thrown out of Spain, went to the Ottoman Empire of Turkey and were accepted into the Islamic world. Very different from today, but that has a lot to do with 20th century politics. The Jewish Arabic divide is really a modern problem. So, I would also have to say this. Christianity has a pretty dark history. Hopefully, you've got some sense of that. And their history is no darker than ours. It's just different. So, what does Jesus say? Take out the log out of your own eye before you worry about the speck in someone else's. So, race relations. This is something that is very much a part of Islamic culture, that they have much less of a problem with racial differences than we do, at least in European and American Christianity. But there are elements of Islam that keep the people united in different ways. We've got the daily prayer, so everybody everywhere. So if you travel and it's time for a canonical prayer, you're going to get down next to whoever is next to you, right? It's not like a door you have to walk through, like a church or a synagogue or a mosque even. You get down next to whoever's with you. The pilgrimage of Mecca. So if you go there, you're going to find people of all sort of racial backgrounds, all together. The lands that were conquered by Muhammad originally and the original caliphs were had a variety of racial makeups to them. So it begins in a way that just, and then I would also add the idea of reading the unification of Arabic as them being able to communicate because they've all studied at least some basic Arabic. And by the way, one of the largest concentrations of Muslims in the world is in Malaysia. But they have all studied Arabic just like the Muslims of Saudi Arabia. And then, of course, they're very much, history of what we might think of as interracial marriages. So that's just not an issue in that religion as well. So I then wanted to talk about the use of force, because we have a lot of, this whole concept of jihad, and particularly as some would make us think in the West that jihad is sort of this no holds barred, at any cost conquering of anyone who's different than them. And there is actually in Islam a very, very intensely applied just war theory. So there's a just war theory in Christianity, and just war theory in Islam is very much like that. So it talks about what is acceptable. in a war. Agreements to be honored, wounded are not to be mutilated, nor the dead disfigured. And then this entire concept of the women, children, the old. So what do we call them? Non-combatants. But also food sources and sacred objects are to be spared. So here a thing we've been hearing some stories out of the Middle East with ISIS or whatever you want to call them, blowing up various sites. Um, w- they are not practicing good Islam. They are, there are corrupt people. There are people who willfully misunderstand or misapply their rules for their own, whatever they think their higher purpose is. But groups like ISIS, they do not represent traditional Islam, or even in traditional or good or even Islam. So there is also then, when is war justified? Defensive wars are acceptable. And that's the only reason to go to war except to right a horrendous wrong. So if you see a credible injustice, now here's where groups like ISIS might play the game, so to speak, to say, well, Christians are just horrendously wrong, so we need to attack Christians. But that is just so outside of the box that it's horrifying to even, it's horrifying to Muslims. We should not take these extreme groups as representative. And this idea of jihad, much misunderstood. So I think that that's not a particularly long PowerPoint, but this next one's going to be. So I'm going to pause and we'll come back and talk about law in Islam because that's a big deal.